Inside the 2022 Subaru WRX. If you've ever gotten into a modern Subaru, you're going to feel right at home with this thing. From the plastics to the dash design to the interior electronics, feels like a corporate modern Subaru. And honestly, that's not a bad thing, at least when it comes to the dash layout. Because of how low it is, there's a ton of interior glass, which means you have minimal blind spots. This car is grown versus the vehicle it replaces, which means the interior space is bigger, and you have an even more usable trunk. The rear seats fold down, and you can fit like a mountain bike back there. The back seats are also pretty comfortable. Despite losing a little bit of headroom, a full-size adult should fit back there with no issues. The front seats are totally redesigned. The tracks have more movement in them so they can go further back or forward, and the seat design is entirely new. They've changed the internal seat construction, and you have 3 different seat options. You have an all-cloth or a Alcantara on cloth version, and you have the Recaro seat, which I've never been in and I have no idea what that thing's like. When it comes to the seating position, you sit up pretty high in this car. Honestly, you can't get it that low, and the seats themselves lack adjustable lumbar support. When it comes to the rest of the ergonomics of this cabin, it's mostly good. The pedal box is easy to heel toe, the steering wheel doesn't feel like a total turd, and the shifter falls right to hand. Not to mention the fact that you have a physical e-brake, which is wonderful. Really, the only con when it comes to the interior ergonomics is kind of a weird complaint, but it's the armrests. The center armrest feels like a total piece of crap. It's really hard, and if you are a shorter driver, you can't use it anyway because it's so far back. And if you are a taller driver, the door armrest and the center console armrest are not at the same height, which is really frustrating from an OCD perspective. Now, when it comes to the interior electronics, that's the other big controversy of this car, other than the way it looks, of course. They have now gone to the corporate giant tablet for all trims higher than a premium. So the premium, Limited, and GT all get this giant center tablet. The base model, and again, I've not used the base model screen, comes with a dual screen. The tablet, at least, for the most part, works pretty well. It's far better than something like the VW infotainment system. You still have physical controls for things like volume and the basic HVAC controls, but the fan speed and heated seat controls are built in the infotainment system. The screen quality is average at best, but it reacts pretty quickly, and unlike other generations of this technology, it does not seem to be as affected by cold weather. Apple CarPlay also works pretty well. When it comes to the audio system, I know nobody cares in a WRX, but in short, it's not great. It's definitely not going to win any awards. If you compare it to the standard Bose in a Mazda 3 or a Civic Si, this leaves a lot to be desired. But with all that said, I think it's time for us to head into the shop and put this thing up on the lift. So Mark, we're underneath the 2022 WRX, and before we talk about anything else, I think it's time for us to talk about the elephant man in the room, the styling.
Oh yeah, that's right, the styling. So I told our Subaru reps, I'm like, look, we're not gonna focus too much on this because it doesn't matter if this car was perfect, people are still gonna talk about, 90% of the comments are about how hideous this thing is. I've never been a Subaru like fanatic, I've never owned a WRX, but I know where people are coming from when you make changes. This is the thing. The WRX has never been the most beautiful car, traditionally beautiful car. It has always been quirky, awkward styling. They go from bulbous and then they go back to like conservative and people complain about that, and then they go back to aggressive, and now they're kind of following that SUV, CUV trend where it's a little bit more rugged. And I'm just gonna leave it at that. This is not a car that you're gonna look back at and be like, oh my God, it's just this beautiful car, and it was never designed to be that way from the get-go. It's never been a traditionally pretty car. However, you're going to tell me a little bit why they have some of this unpainted material and the science or engineering behind some of it.
So thankfully for this loan, Subaru provided us with a lot of technical support through their reps, and they gave me a couple reasons behind this styling, or a couple, I guess, excuses. The first thing is, most WRX owners, according to their focus groups, always want their car to be more aggressive looking, and well, this is what you get. It's more aggressive looking, so
here you go.
Yeah.
You got what you asked for.
The second thing is that every single time they release one of these cars, people freak out. Every generation is apparently more ugly or more boring looking than the prior generation vehicle. They think you'll get over it, and that's up to you to get over it or not.
And they think you'll get over it based on how it drives. That was a big point.
And the last thing is this is actually functional. All this unpainted black plastic on the rear diffuser, on the side skirts, and on the front of this car has a hexagonal pattern on it, which is more aerodynamic. It helps reduce wind turbulence, which in turn will make this more aero-stable at high speeds, particularly around the sides of this vehicle, and translate less wind noise into the cabin. The other thing they've done is extended all the Aero panels underneath this car, which again reduces NVH. It's a quieter car because of it. And theoretically, at least, it's more Aero stable at high speeds.
And they do that in multiple ways underneath as well. The hexagonal shape is only here, really, in a small portion of it, but there are different lips and different contours of these plastic trays that help smooth out airflow, direct airflow over the elongated panels, and it's one of the smoothest airflows exiting the back of the car, which again increases stability aerodynamically, and you could make this huge argument on an enthusiast car like this at this price point. We're not talking about a race car here. So they have chosen this over some of the appearance part, and I think the appearance part is more important to most of these people in the demographic, but time will tell, Jack.
So the other thing to talk about is all of the improvements to the suspension architecture and really the platform itself. So this is on the most recent version of Subaru's global platform, which means it has a bunch of manufacturing improvements. More high-strength steel, the welding process has changed, and more adhesives, which means this car is more rigid, which should increase the handling performance of this car, and it is much quieter, plus it is safer. And they changed something in their manufacturing process, Mark.
Yes, they did, and this is learned from other models in their lineup, like Forester, etc. So as they make improvements, they figure out, oh, how can we do things better and easier while adding more welds, more adhesive. So like in the Impreza, there's 7 meters of structural adhesive. Now there's 26 in this car. The other part is welding processes. They're able to get more robots in during the body-on-white welding process before they attach hang-on panels or welded panels onto the back. And you're going to see some of these videos. But again, it's about that improvement, and all of that equates to what?
So this car is bigger than it used to be, but despite being bigger and more rigid and having more NVH material, it has not gained much more weight. And in some trim levels, it's lighter than the prior generation vehicle. Now let's talk about the suspension. So in the front, Mark, they went to a different steering system.
It's a dual pinion steering rack, so they've moved the motor off where the torque sensor is. So the motor is now moved to the side of the rack. So the torque sensor is looking at wheel input and how much torque is there, and then it can send the signal to the motor, and by moving the motor over here, the power or the force is distributed across the rack versus just on that input point. So when you turn a little bit, there's no power dip. When you turn initially, you feel smooth. When you turn it harder, it feels smooth, and there's no like dip or ramp. And a lot of manufacturers or suppliers are moving their motors off that center point to the side of the rack. So this is nothing new, but it's new for Subaru.
So in theory, at least, this should feel like a more natural steering setup. It should have more natural initial turn-in. The other thing they've done to increase front-end feel is they've changed the offset of the wheels themselves. They're slightly more aggressive, which should lead to, theoretically, better turn-in and better high-speed stability. The suspension setup has also been revised. The dampers themselves now have more stroke, and then they have more travel, which means they should ride a little bit better. They're a little bit more compliant like you get in like a CV or SUV. But in the front, they've included assist springs in the dampers themselves to help control rebound a little bit better. And you want to explain that?
Yeah, so when you increase wheel travel, that means that wheel is compressing, and then you have to have the shock rebounded. So that rebounding force goes up, and on a performance car, like a traditional CUV, SUV, you can have a more floaty ride, but they need more body control. So you'd have to ramp up the rebound rates of the shocks where you get this like jolty effect as it's rebounding. So the way that they can offset that is to have an assist spring inside the shock that offloads some of that rebound valving. You can have that shock rebound from the spring and then take over the valving. So the concept is you still get a sporty ride, but you're getting a smoother ride with more wheel travel. And, you know, this is the way Subaru decided to do it up front.
The two things I want to talk about really quick, Mark, before we get underneath the hood, is the rear sway bar design. And that comes from this global platform. You want to talk about that?
The rear subframe is different here because it is mounted closer to the chassis. It's bolted up to the subframe part where it mounts up to the body, not on the center part or on the inner part of the subframe. And one of the benefits of doing it this way is they can use softer bushings in the subsequent suspension points or the subsequent mounting points. And in a traditional setup, there's a lot of flex or deflection in the subframe itself because that sway bar always has this counteracting force of twisting force. So moving it up to the body reduces that, and they can use softer bushings, which then in turn results into a softer, more compliant ride.
Translation, the car has better ride quality and it still maintains its body control fairly well. The rear suspension's multi-link. A lot of the improvements in the front made it to the rear of this car, but the big story is the all-wheel drive setups of this vehicle. You have two different all-wheel drive systems, one for the manual, which is a 50-50 viscous system. It's very similar to other Subarus, and has torque vectoring by brake. And then you have a CVT all-wheel drive system. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the torque vectoring by brake is all four corners of the car.
Yes.
The Subaru Performance transmission, that's what they've rebranded their CVT to, and there's still a belt. There's a steel belt in here with the pulleys that adjust themselves, but the internal pumps, the internal design allows it to feel more like a traditional torque-converted automatic while still giving you the benefits of a CVT. So in automatic mode, it's trying to keep the engine in the preferred zone for fuel economy, smoothness. You don't get a bunch of gear shock or fake gear shock. But when you want to take over manual control, and those shifts are way more natural and less rubber bandy than those old CVTs. Now the concept is maybe also that it's going to be more reliable. It shouldn't be feeling as shitty as some of the other ones. And that's what they decided to do here versus a torque converted. But they're both made in-house inside Subaru. They've been developed internally, CVT and manual.
And the CVT also gets a different power split for the all-wheel drive system. It's 55% rear, 45% front. But Mark, with that, I think it's time for us to get underneath the hood.
Now that we're under the hood, we're looking at Subaru's new global engine family, the 2.4 liter. This has a turbo, however, and there are some big differences between this and some of the other 2.4s in the same engine family.
Yes, so the internals have been beefed up, allegedly at least. Subaru USA does not know what's been done inside this motor, but Japan has assured them that the mechanical bits and bobs inside the engine have been improved to deal with the fact that this is going to receive more abuse and live in a higher RPM range. The other thing is this does have a unique valve train that is unique to the WRX, not found on other cars, again, to the higher RPM
What
nature.
in the valve train, though? Just the springs?
The springs themselves.
Okay, and there might be more, but we don't know because Subaru Japan keeps that close to the chest.
The turbo is also unique to this car, and it has some unique technology like electronic control.
It has electronic bypass and electronic wastegate on the turbo itself, and that is for response.
Yes.
Moving it closer to that, well, where the air is, you reduce lag, you reduce airflow issues, all of that goes into turbocharging.
They claim this car in third gear at 45 miles an hour is faster to respond than the prior generation 2 liter. But I did do something a little different for once. I took this to AMS Performance, a high-performance shop based out of the Chicagoland area. They are probably the foremost tuner of things related to Nissans and other Japanese cars, plus some Audi stuff. And they put this on a 4-wheel dyno. And I don't know how else to say this. It makes less torque than the last car. This makes about 246 horsepower, which is identical to the prior generation 2 liter, and makes about the same amount of torque, 240 odd.
So we need to talk about that because this is the biggest complaint other than the looks. How can you go after 20 years making the same horsepower as the old cars essentially and making less power in some ways and having this huge increased displacement over the 2 liter?
So there's a couple ways to look at this. Yes, theoretically, in the same gear, under the same conditions, this car is now slower than the last generation WRX because it makes 20 foot-pounds less of wheel torque. The other way to look at it is if you actually look at the dyno plot, and I spent a lot of time talking to AMS's engineer, their calibration engineer, and went, wow, this car is far better calibrated than the prior generation 2 liter. The torque comes in almost 1,000 RPM earlier, and it makes peak torque essentially right away. And if you look at the torque graph, it is a flat line. It makes peak torque essentially all the way to redline, which the last car did not. The last car, if you've driven a 2 liter, felt like ass. I'm going to be honest. It was peaky. It didn't make consistent power. This does.
Okay, so I think this is the big takeaway, and this is the thing when we're talking about power numbers on any car, is it's just a number. You could make 1,000 horsepower and the car could drive like shit. You could make 100 horsepower and it may be actually more fun than a 1,000 horsepower car because the drivability is smoother. And Subaru, it doesn't matter if we're talking about the old BRZ, FRS, before that, the old 2 liter, some of the STIs we drove, the tuning was always really flaky. You had timing being pulled, you had stutters in performance, you had hesitation, you had weird power delivery, like you could be in second and it felt smooth, and then third you're like, it's like, like pulling power. This car, and granted it is cold out right now by us, is way smoother, it's more linear, it doesn't have that herky-jerky effect, it's just, like you said, and the tuner said, way better calibrated. So while you may not have the ultimate performance at this point, which obviously people are going to be putting stage 10s on here, it gives you a better building point out of the box, and then when you start to screw with it, you're going to have more overhead because you have more displacement to work with.
Yes, and that is the big thing. You don't drive peak horsepower numbers, and this car makes peak horsepower, speaking of that, at basically the same point the prior generation car did, around 5,500 RPM. This car, however, when compared to the prior generation WRX, only revs to 6,000 RPM, where the last car revved like 6,500. But with the improvements to the manual gearbox, and they did some revisions to that, and engine tuning as a whole, there's far less rev hang in this car than the prior generation 2-liter. But Mark, I think we beat that to death, so it's time for us to take this out on the road.
All right, Jack.
Mark, we're in the 2022 WRX, and what do you feel?
Why are you whispering?
Well, I'm trying to set the mood.
Set the mood for what? This is a performance machine. Oh!
Feel that 2.4 liter.
All right, Jack, let's get right into it. We know the biggest change here is the engine, and how is it?
While it makes less peak torque, in reality, in the real world, when you're actually driving this car, it feels faster.
I never thought I would say this about a Subaru engine, or engine tuning rather. It feels well done.
It doesn't feel like it was done by the interns anymore?
No, it doesn't feel like there's a ton of weird programming problems and timing being pulled or hesitation, herky-jerky. It's so smooth.
Look, I'll slow down.
Okay.
1,000 RPM. Building. Look. That felt consistent.
It's smooth all the way up. Doesn't matter what gear, and obviously we're in the cold, so take that for what it's worth. You know, it might heat soak and have some timing pulled in different environments, but for us, this feels great. Feels way better, let's just put it this way, it feels way better to drive everywhere than the 2-liter in the previous WRX.
And listen to it, Mark. No fake engine noise.
I really like it, man. I really like the engine and transmission combo here with the manual. You know, the only thing that I would complain about is the fact that it runs out of revs. You know, it pulls so strong to the red line, and the red line's so low, you're just like, holy shit, give me more. And I don't know, you know, that's just where we're at.
Yeah, to be fair to this engine though, the last engine and this engine make peak horsepower at about the same time, 5,500 RPM. So while you are losing out on like the extra 500 to 600 RPM, doesn't really matter, because in the last car, just like this car, the last 500 to 600 horsepower don't do anything anyway.
So Subaru said, you know, once you drive this thing, you're gonna kind of accept it and really enjoy it. And I think there's some truth to that. So let's talk about the other part of it. The handling and changes in suspension and body structure compared to the last WRX. What do you think?
I think in this cold weather, mind you, the pavement gets worse when it's at like 4 degrees out, and the shocks are a little bit stiffer because the fluid doesn't flow as well. I think it rides quite well, actually. I think it rides better than the last car. It appears to, at least on this set of all-season tires, in our conditions, to have better road holding. The front end, while yes, you don't really feel anything in this electric rack, does seem to load up the front suspension quite nicely. And on top of that, at this price point, in the mid-30s or low 30s, it's the only all-wheel drive option you have.
Yeah, I think that's the big selling point. I will say, just on the all-seasons, and of course, the pavement is littered with salt, so it basically reduces traction. So I can't really say if the front end loads up like the last WRX, because the last WRX, that's one of the highlights of it. The front end felt really strong and connected. Here, you're just kind of sliding the front end all over the place, and it definitely understeers more. The other part is the ride. This car, to me, doesn't do as good of a job on the subtle impacts, the subtle imperfections. When you get a big shunt or a big compression event, that's where it shines compared to the last car. And other than that, the all-wheel drive system, they may have done some retuning here, but it feels almost identical to me as every other WRX in terms of like dynamics of how it transfers power.
But that all-wheel drive system in conditions like this, right? I'm gonna nail it through a corner. Does a good job. It doesn't want to wash out the front end like you get in a GTI or the Civic Si in bad or inclement weather.
This is what you're getting here. People are going to ask, well, what's the difference between a car like the Si, which we just did a video on? And the Si is cheaper, there's no doubt. But is this like $3,000, $4,000 better? And I will definitely say the all-wheel drive system gives you so much flexibility and versatility in terms of performance and putting the power down. Not only that, the all-wheel drive system makes it usable all year round and you can do stupid shit. But this thing feels way faster than the SI as you start to pull up in the speed.
I mean, just look at the dyno sheet. It makes 40 more wheel horsepower.
It's such a big difference. So, can you deal with the differences in interior? There's going to be trade-offs in every car. We're joking around about this. What's the ideal car? There's like a GTI engine, a Civic manual transmission and shifter feel.
Civic interior.
Civic interior. This car is all-wheel drive, but that doesn't exist. So you constantly are fighting about what is the best car to get for your money.
So here are the pros to me. Outside of the way this thing looks, you have the all-wheel drive. You have a okay-ish interior. It's better than the GTI's infotainment system without.
Even though it looks like it's designed for Windows Vista, it's still functional and it doesn't lag out.
No.
And there's still some physical controls they've kept.
And it arguably will have better residual than something like a GTI, and it rides really well, and it's quieter than a Civic Si, at least in my opinion.
Personally, I think it's a little bit quieter. I would argue the ride quality, at least to me, is they're so close, at least in the conditions we're driving in right now. I don't think that's a factor either.
On really bad bumps, so I had this on like I-90 and 290 by us, Chicago highways. And at 80 to 85 miles an hour over the bad pavement, it does a slightly better job.
Okay.
And at least at highway speeds, to me, it's quieter.
Okay.
But where you really lose versus the GTI and the SI is the fuel economy. Yeah. It's not horrible. I mean, we're not talking V8 bad, but it's under similar conditions. I averaged about 20 miles per gallon, where in the SI, I averaged over 30.
Yeah, that could be a deal breaker if you're putting a lot of miles on this thing. Even though it's an enthusiast car, it's probably a stretch purchase for a lot of people that are buying this. And if you're going to rack up 12,000 miles a month, you're gonna be flushing a lot of fuel down the toilet.
Yes, and the other big con of WRXs is the insurance premiums. Something that I hear a lot from younger buyers. You get raked over the coals when you try to go insure this car versus something like an SI.
Well, the Civic is also high.
But not like this.
Well, this is higher, but the Civic is also really high, so you might be splitting hairs there. I mean, again, this is something for a buyer to research. All we can really talk about here, Jack, is what's the best thing about this car, and now it's time to head into the final thoughts where you're going to explain that.
All right, Mark. Final thoughts on the 2022 Subaru WRX, and I wanted to say this first. Huge thanks to Martin and Miles at AMS Performance, who were kind enough to allow us to put this on the dyno for you, and to our Subaru reps who spent an enormous amount of time with us so we were in a better position to teach you about the engineering behind this product. So what do I think about the car itself? Well, to be honest, I think the internet headline, which is this car is both uglier than the vehicle it replaces and makes less power, thus is slower than the car it replaces, does not in any way accurately summarize what this vehicle is like to actually live with. Because in the real world, you don't drive a spec sheet. And when you spend time with this vehicle and you compare it to the car it replaces, it feels faster, and there's a couple reasons for it. The first is it delivers torque earlier than the car it replaces, and it delivers power more consistently. The tuning of this engine is far superior versus a 2-liter. The other big improvements, of course, are all the body structure and suspension changes, which makes this car handle better, it's quieter than the car it replaces, and is overall a far more pleasant vehicle to live with. So what are its negatives? Well, other than some ergonomic complaints about the cabin, the big one is fuel economy. If you compare this to something like a Golf R or GTI, which the E888 makes more power and torque than this and delivers better fuel economy, it's kind of a hard pill to swallow. But past that, I really hope to be able to drive this thing in the springtime on real summer tires so I can walk you through what this thing's like to drive at its dynamic limit. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon.